What's up everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today we're finally jumping in on our giveaway F150 to get some stuff started. And like we promised, we got a Stage 5 kit from Icon to install, and as you can see, we have it done here, but we're going to be showing you how to do the install on your own truck today. Even if you don't have a Stage 5 and you're just looking for an install guide on doing the 2.5 coilovers or the 2.5 rear shocks, this should still be plenty helpful for you. But we are going to go briefly into how to put the arms in, and if you want more details on that specifically, or you're doing just the arms, we have a separate video on those as well that will walk through that install a bit more detailed. We'll mention it, but it's not a huge deal. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get this started. So first things first, once we have the wheel off the truck, we need to go in and loosen up these bolts that are holding the brackets for the ABS lines and brake lines and everything, so we can get a little bit more slack in here. That way we're not going to pull and break these once we start pulling the suspension apart. So first one we're going to get is this 10 mil in the back, then we'll do the 10 down here, and this small one with the little plastic clip on the end at the front. This last little screw is going to be a 5/16. You also want to make sure you come behind the knuckle here where there's a little vacuum line attaching to the hub. It's just a rubber line that's held on with pressure, so you're going to want to wiggle that back off those ports so that way it doesn't pull or tear it. There we go, and we'll just hold that line out of the way. To get to our axle nut, we just need to remove this little dust cap, and usually some vice grips or channel lock should be plenty good to grab onto the end of this and just wiggle it back. And then here you can see the nut. This is going to be a 1/2 inch socket here to get this off, and I like using a deep well or an extension to get past the actual studs. All right, we're going to leave that on just right at the end of the threads for now, just so it holds it, and we'll take this off once we have everything else disassembled. Now, this next step is somewhat optional, but I like to go in and loosen these mounts at the frame for the upper control arm, so that way there's not a bunch of tension on this. And once we get a little further into the install, we're going to be actually removing the control arm anyways, because we have a new one to put in here. So what you need is just some wrenches, an 18 and a 21 should work, to get on there and loosen these up. Now we're going to take an 18 millimeter deep well. We're going to go ahead and slide it around the nut for this upper control arm and start loosening this up. Now I'm going to leave this loose on here for a minute, and we're going to come down to the tie rod end and loosen this up as well. We're going to use a 21 millimeter deep well to get around this nut. So if your truck has some mileage on it and a little bit of wear, this is probably going to be seized into the knuckle, and you'll just want to tap the end of the knuckle here with a hammer to break that free, but don't hit the actual ball joint or the tie rod. Now on ours, you can see it actually is just going to pull out fine because this truck is so new. So we're going to slide that out and put the nut on here so we don't lose it. We can keep that off to the side. Underneath the lower control arm, we're going to take an 18 millimeter to loosen up this nut for the sway bar, so that way this end link can come through. Moving back up to the top, we're going to take this nut all the way off for our upper control arm. And a lot of times you'll end up just spinning the stud kind of infinitely without getting the nut all the way off. So what you can do is take an 18 millimeter wrench and then take a 5/16 socket on a ratchet, and you can use that to go ahead and get it free. Now, once again, if you have a truck with a bit more mileage on it, this ball joint is probably going to be seized into the knuckle here. Ours is actually pretty loose just because everything's brand new, so it really hasn't had time to. But if yours is seized and isn't coming through even with the nut off, you just want to tap on the end of the knuckle here with a hammer, and you really might have to be more aggressive than a tap to get that free. But just make sure you're not hitting the arm or the ball joint itself. With everything disassembled up top, we're going to come back down and remove the nut for the axle there, so that way we can get just a little bit more play. For the bottom end of the strut, there's going to be 2 nuts underneath that A-arm that we need to get to, so we're going to use an 18 to take those off, and then we can work our way on the top. At the top, there's going to be 3 nuts you need to get to. The front 2 are pretty easy. The one in the back you might have to be a little more creative with, but I'm going to use an 18mm wrench to break these free, and then we can use a socket to get it all the rest of the way off, and then that'll allow us to get the whole strut out. Everything's off, so now we just have to work the coilover out, and usually you just have to give a bit of pressure downwards on this A-arm, so that way you can get the bottom end out and then pull the top from there. So if you're reusing your factory upper control arm in the suspension, then you can just leave it here up and out of the way and go straight to putting in the new coilover. But since we're swapping ours, I figured it was worth mentioning real quick. All you need to do is pull out this nut and bolt that we had earlier that we loosened up. We're going to take those all the way out, pull the arm out, and then we can just swap the new Icon one in. All right, so we've got our new Icon billet upper control arm. I'm going to slide this into place, and it's worth noting that we do have another full install video on just this upper control arm if you guys want to check that out. But all we need to do is get it sitting in here. Then we're going to take those factory bolts and slot them back through. So we're going to put our new Icon coilover in place here. Get it settled in. And you do want to make sure there is a driver and a passenger. So we've got the driver's side here, and you want that resi to be facing up so we can mount it over here on the frame. So what we need to do next is take the new hardware provided by Icon, run those bolts through the top to get it positioned, and then we can work on the bottom. Once you got the top 3 bolts started by hand on the Icon top hat, then you're going to want to take a 9/16 socket, tighten them down just a little bit more, but leave some play so that way you can get the bottom bolts through and still work that strut into place. And once it's done, then we can tighten everything down all the way. So for the lower hardware, you're going to have these 2 lag bolts that come from Icon with your kit. You'll want to have one washer on the bottom, and this is going to come up and thread through the actual bar on the lower part of the coilover. But when you do that, you want to make sure you slide these black washers into place, and that's going to kind of help fill that gap around it. And then we'll use a 5/8 socket underneath to tighten this up, and we can do the other side as well. Now we got both the top and bottom hardware all tightened together, and at this point you can either start torquing everything to spec as you go, or what I usually do is assemble everything and then at the end go through and torque all of it back to spec, so that way I can use it as sort of a time to double check. But you do want to make sure you have it tight. So now we're going to take this nut off the delta joint on our upper control arm. We'll get that knuckle up into place. There we go. Now, what I'm going to do before I tighten this up is also bring our tie rod in, so that way I have something to support the knuckle and it's not just wobbling around everywhere. With this, make sure that your reservoir and hose are outside of that tie rod end. You don't want to accidentally trap it in here and not be able to get the reservoir back out, because you're going to have to redo a lot of steps. So as long as that's clear, we can get this in loosely, and now we can work on tightening that upper control arm, getting the delta joint through, and we'll come back and tighten the tie rod. So that way this is all really locked in. Ours tightened up just fine, but if this is just spinning the ball joint, once again, you can put a socket on the end of here and turn it with a wrench to make sure it actually tightens up, but this looks like it's all good. Now we're gonna put this nut back on our end link for that sway bar. Now make sure you take your nut and thread it on by hand to get it started on the end of the axle here. And then we can take our 1/2-inch socket again and get this tightened down. There we go. Once again, everything to factory spec. Make sure you don't over tighten this because you don't have to give it a ton of pressure. And make sure you don't forget, as you're getting everything assembled, to come back up to the top and tighten down your mounts for that upper control arm. We got them most of the way there when we put this on, but it's still a little bit loose. So a couple turns with the wrench will get it locked in. Now we're going to reattach all of our ABS and brake lines here with the same hardware that we used before. And I'm going to start by just making sure I get the vacuum line for the IWEs reattached in the back here so I don't forget it. There we go. After you've got all of your lines attached, you'll notice that the brake lines and the vacuum line here will either be touching or really, really close to the new upper control arm. So it's not a bad idea to just go in here with a screwdriver or some sort of pry tool and just kind of work this bracket over just a little bit so that way you get some good clearance in here and that arm is going to hit it when it drops down. One of the last things we need to do up front is get our bracket mounted for that external reservoir. Now, to do this, the bracket's going to sit kind of in this location, and if you look closely, you can see I already marked where my hole's going to be. But what you typically want to do is put the hose clamps on this bracket, test fit, make sure it's going to work, and the resi's going to sit pretty close to where the crash bar is. But once you have it, then you can use a drill bit, 11/32 to punch out this hole, and Icon gives you a new screw that's going to go in there to hold the bracket in place. Now, before we do that, the other thing we need to address is the hose clamps. So what I've got here is the hose clamp that comes in the kit, but you can see there's this heat shrink layer around it to help protect the reservoir. Now, Icon doesn't put this on for you, so what you'll need to do is open up your hose clamps all the way and kind of flatten them out. Then you're going to take that heat shrink strip that they give you, and you're going to cut about 2 inches or 1 3/4 inches off of it, and you're going to wrap that around the belt of the hose clamp. Then once you have it tucked in all the way, you're going to hit that with your heat gun. That'll shrink it down, and you'll have an end that's pretty exposed that still has the little cuts in it, and you want that to be the case because that's what it's going to have to grab onto to actually tighten. So once you have it done, it should look like this. I've got one of the hose clamps here, and that's what you're going to slide over to hold this to the bracket. The resi's in here rock solid now, and we have plenty of access to the adjustment for the CDC valves, which is great. So that's going to be a wrap on the front. Let's move around to the back. The rear shocks are a little bit more simple than the front, and we're doing the driver's side first, but you're going to want to stay tuned for the passenger side because it is slightly different. Now, what we've got here is you're just going to need a 15mm socket and an 18mm wrench to loosen this nut and bolt up, and then you're going to do the same for the top, but we're going to start at the bottom first to swing it free. There we go. Same story up top with removing the nut and bolt. With the new Icon shock, we're just going to position it so that the extra reservoir is pointed towards the back of the truck away from the axle. And we'll bring it up into place here. Get this top mount in first. Go. And as you can see, we're going to reuse the factory hardware here. our top is on, we've got the lower in, and usually you just kind of have to work it in with a screwdriver, kind of adjust here to get that factory bolt through. Now that that's there, we can add the nut to the end. There we go. And we'll get this tightened down. On the passenger side of the truck, like I mentioned before, it's a little bit different because you're gonna need to get your shock up here, and you'll want the resi to point away from the axle again, but this time that'll be the front of the truck. And when you get it in place, you'll see that it's gonna start hitting the bracket here, and it won't mount up quite right once you have it in. And if you're ever driving off-road and your axle articulates down, you're gonna have an issue. So what you actually have to do is come in and grind away a bit of the metal here, give it a little bit more clearance. We're gonna hit it with a quick coat of paint, and then we should be able to get this to mount up no problem. All right, so that's gonna be a wrap on this Icon system for the F-150. Now, in the end there, I did grind away a little bit more metal than I needed to on that rear shock mount. I just wanted to make sure we had plenty of space so that shock wasn't gonna hit or have issues if this thing's articulating off-road. And it's worth mentioning that it is a bit of a struggle to get these shocks to compress enough to fit in the back, but with a buddy and another jack, you can usually kind of pry it and get it to work in there to where you can get it mounted without too much struggle. So I just wanted to put that in there and mention it. But overall, I think the kit looks great. It should perform really, really nice on this truck. And I'm super excited for whoever wins it and gets this thing in a giveaway because this is an excellent suspension system. So with that being said, that's gonna be a wrap on this install. But if you're interested in picking up one of these kits for your truck, you can head down in the description below, click those links. It's gonna shoot you over to our website. And you can also click the link to check out our giveaway page. And I'll see you guys next time.